Hello and welcome to Serious Vintage. I'm Geoff Moes.
I'm Nat Moes.
Today we'll be talking about the Banned and Restricted update, playing Aggro-Control in Vintage without its signature color, the upcoming Team Serious Open, and Serious Food and Drink takes on making cocktails.
Well, we're here with Jake Hilty. He's a friend of ours from the Cleveland area. He's also a new writer on ManaDeprived.com. He's an Eternal writer there, which is pretty cool. We're going to talk to him a little bit about non-blue Aggro-Control in Vintage. He played that before and done pretty well with it, so we thought it'd be interesting to get some of his opinions and some of his strategies. But first, we're going to talk about Banned and Restricted List update. Nothing happened in Vintage, which I think is almost par for the course right now, right?
I think that nothing happening in Vintage is generally par for the course all the time, regardless of whether it's a good idea or not.
Fair enough.
But I think that we are in agreement, though, that this was probably a pretty good idea on not making any changes, at least any attempts to balance the current metagame using a restriction.
Yeah, the metagame seemed pretty balanced.
Obviously, people were talking about wanting to bring down shops a little bit, but I have to agree with Tuan that shops has not been really at the top level with the tier 1 decks in a while, and I think that it is right now, and that's probably, it's shops' time to be there.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
I also would say that if you're in Ohio and you don't think that shops is dominating, it's probably not too bad.
Right. Yeah, Ohio is pretty much Workshop Central still.
Yeah.
Certainly it can be beaten, and certainly it doesn't win every TSO or anything, or very many of them at all.
Do you guys have problems playing against shops? I mean, playing against it, I'm not necessarily worried. Like, I feel prepared for it, and then if I win or lose, it's usually based on a fairly decent back and forth game, I think.
I feel like if I build a deck that has good game against shops, the generic shops, I find that I'm actually writing off one flavor of shops. So I built a deck that I felt performed pretty well against the traditional mud aggro shops. And I was testing it against Tuan's espresso stacks that has smokestacks and all of that really grindy control stuff, and it was just absolutely murdering me. And in trying to tune against that, I was losing game against the more aggro shops. So I think that shops is certainly beatable, but there are also a lot of different ways that it can come at you, which makes it fairly flexible and tough to say, my deck is good against shops.
That's fair enough. That's an interesting point.
But it's also a little bit unfair to say, I think, that if you're not... so sure, you can have problems with one of the flavors of shops, but shops in general is kind of a weird category, right? It encompasses aggro, control, combo. It's weird in another format for a deck to be good against all of those different things. It just so happens that these cards happen to run 4 Lodestone Golem and 4 Mishra's Workshop, but other than that, a lot of the cards are different.
Yeah.
So it's, I don't know if it's fair to say, oh, well, they're all the same deck. They certainly, they're part of the same pillar, if you want to use that kind of vintage vernacular, but I don't think it's like crazy to think that you would have a bad matchup, say, against aggro shops if you were good against stacks and, Forge Master combo or whatever.
Right. As long as you can get rid of artifacts, you can do pretty well.
Heck, 2-card Monty in many versions runs 4 Workshops and 4 Lodestone Golems, but we don't lump that in the same way. So I don't know, it's a little bit hard to say. To call shops like one archetype is very unfair to what shops is able to do, I think.
Right. And it's probably more that Workshops has gone from being a sort of one-trick pony to the level where blue is, where you have this base number of cards that show up in a lot of different decks, but there's a variety of things that come of that. You can play aggro shops, you can play prison shops, you can play combo shops, and all of them are pretty good right now.
Yeah.
And that seems perfectly okay to me.
Right.
I would agree with that.
I think that we were talking a little bit earlier, the idea that we wouldn't have restricted anything doesn't eliminate the possibility that we wouldn't mind seeing something unrestricted.
Right.
Like Vintage isn't in such a situation where things are so stable, we want to keep them in that stable position forever. I don't think it would have been a bad idea if we had seen something, one of the lower power restricted cards to be unrestricted, and I think that list, there are some decent candidates on that list.
Yeah, I'm fine with them being a little bit more experimental as far as the restricted list goes, and I think it would have been interesting to see something like Thirst come back or Gifts. I know that people complain about the power level of those, and what they would do, but, I think it's fine every once in a while to see what they would do and actually try them out. It's fine enough to speculate, but, let's see what happens.
I think that Wizards is afraid of making a mistake. I think they're afraid of jeopardizing their credibility with players, and let's be honest, they don't have any credibility left with vintage players anyway. But I think that they're really afraid of making that mistake and having to take something back, but I wouldn't mind it.
I mean, the other thing too is, and I don't know if this is a general feeling for everybody, but it sort of seems to be, that we want ban lists or restricted lists to be as small as they can be.
Sure.
I mean, without having something dominating, obviously. So I think that's where a lot of the call, at least in Legacy, and I think in Vintage too, comes from when we want to have specific cards unrestricted.
Right. Because
why cut off a card that could be fun to play even if it's, maybe not that good?
Right.
As some writer said about Vintage at one point, like, when you ban a card from Vintage, you're really cutting it off from playing Magic at all. And when you restrict a card that's not a super high power level, I mean, you are kind of relegating it to not being played at all.
Yeah, it's true.
Right.
There are a bunch of cards on there that can't be played as one-ofs, but as four-ofs would be quite good. Possibly format warping, but possibly creating a decent deck all their own around that engine. So.
But I don't know to what extent you guys want to get into the unrestricting business.
I think that's a subject that's been gone over many times, so we probably don't need to really get into it.
That's fair.
It's just safe to say, no changes, cool with it. Could have shaken things up a little bit, didn't, not gonna get upset about it.
Yeah. I'm more happy that they didn't restrict anything than I am upset that they didn't unrestrict anything.
Agreed.
Yeah, definitely true.
Yeah. Speaking of things that are not restricted, let's go on to the next topic of non-blue aggro-control in Vintage. So we're talking about decks like Jund, we're talking Naya Aggro, Red-Green Beats, I guess we would even cover things like Dark Times.
So do we get to play any really cool restricted cards that we normally don't get to play in blue, but we get to play in these other colors?
Generally, no.
You don't want balance in your aggro deck?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are scenarios where there are cards like that you might want to play, but in my experience, no, we don't play any cards or any cards that you wouldn't normally play that are on the restricted list.
Looking at some of your decks, do you have restricted cards? I guess you'd have Strip Mine.
You have Strip Mine. Generally, you run the on-color Moxen or some of the on-color Moxen, and you run Black Lotus.
Okay.
I mean, Black Lotus is good in Vintage, right? I mean, like, there's no deck where you're gonna say, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. Twan might listen to this. But there are very few decks where you will say, Black Lotus, that card seems pretty bad. I don't think that I want that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. 3 free mana, even as a one-shot, is pretty good.
Yeah. Right. For a deck like one of the aggro decks that I've played, that 3 mana usually translates to 2 lock pieces on turn 1.
Yeah, it's like a time walk, right?
Oh yeah, it's so good. I mean, it's so strong that you get to play 2 things on turn 1 because generally you're pretty behind the other decks. Or, I mean, you can feel like you're playing from behind even though you have some powerful plays of your own.
Right. Let's sort of start at the beginning. What's, if you're building a non-blue aggro control deck, what's your goal? How do you think about it from a strategic point of view?
Well, so my general step has been to look at the things that basically you didn't want to have happen in Fish a long time ago, or don't want to happen to you kind of regularly by big blue decks. So in this case, that's casting Tinker for Blightsteel Colossus, which traditionally has been a bad thing for aggro decks, or getting a fast kind of combo out. Because things like counterspells, whatever, you don't care that much about the counterspells. Right. What are they going to counter? One of your many 2/2 creatures for 2.
One of your many redundant creatures.
Yeah. So, I mean, that is one thing that's nice about these decks, but the things that you have to look at are those kind of constraining factors. And I think those tend to be, from blue decks, Tinker, and there's an extent to which you can say just having the Time Vault combo somewhere in the 60 is a constraint, just because it's very easy to win out of nowhere. And then from the Stacks decks, it's just kind of their explosiveness. So, the ways that you can kind of constrain those things, because your cards, you don't see as many cards as the other decks do other than shops. You have to kind of pick answers that can answer more than one of those things at once. Your cards have to do double duty a lot at a time. And what that means is we play things like, well, we used to play Null Rod and now we have Stony Silence if we're playing white. because that equalizes the playing field and it answers a lot of different pieces. We also play things like Grafdigger's Cage because they have a lot of value against a lot of different things, especially Tinker.
Sure. Are you even playing, like, some Grafdigger's Cages main?
Oh, I play 3 Grafdigger's Cages main in almost every build that I do. It's actually kind of funny. I didn't make the deck with Dredge in mind. I was thinking more about blue and some of the flavors of workshops, but I was surprised by how good my game ones against Dredge have been with this deck because you have 3 Grafdigger's Cages and because you have Pithing Needles and creatures that can sacrifice themselves. I mean, you have a lot of ways to kind of interact with those decks, whereas many vintage decks don't have that in game 1 against Dredge.
Sure.
Yeah, we're looking at your white, red, green Aggro-Control, Mana Aggro, and you have, among other things, 4 Swords to Plowshares, 2 Lightning Bolts, 3 Stony Silence, 3 Grafdigger's Cage, and 3 Pithing Needles as your non-creatures. And I mean, Grafdigger's Cage and Pithing Needle are both really, really good against Dredge.
Yeah, and I mean, even Lightning Bolt is not bad because you have so many creatures, and like, killing their bridges is a big step toward winning the game.
Right.
Plus, if you swords their dudes, they don't get to go to the graveyard.
That's true. Although swords is usually one of the first cuts when you're sideboarding.
Yeah, makes sense, but at least you might get some.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
In the first game.
We also, and this is sort of a funny thing, but we have some creatures that kind of match up well, and this is an interesting list. It does not have Tarmogoyf in it.
Sure.
And I've had Tarmogoyf in various lists before, but in my experience, Tarmogoyf's not actually that good against any of the decks that aren't other creature decks. And
because it doesn't do anything to disrupt.
Yeah, it doesn't do anything, and it's nice to be able to close out a game, but if you ever have to play something on turn 2 and it's Tarmogoyf, you're just not going to win. You need all of your guys to do more work than that.
Right.
And so, what I was going to say about, like, the Dredge matchup then is that our kind of replacement for that is Porcelain Legionnaire.
Okay.
It seems a little bit silly, but it does attack for 3, which is, kind of a big deal for this deck because it doesn't have many creatures that can attack for more than 2. But also because, in addition to being a beater and being able to kind of, first strike guys, hopefully if you're playing Dredge, they don't have bridges in the board, but it matches up really well with Lodestone Golem.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, in the shop matchup, sure.
And you'd much rather have a card that matches up well with Lodestone Golem than a card like Tarmogoyf, which sometimes does and sometimes doesn't.
Right.
But is always hard to cast.
I imagine that Porcelain Legionnaire shreds other dude decks even better than Tarmogoyf does. I remember Hazard, I think it was Hazard, playing against Wizards, playing Wizards, or someone playing Wizards, and
I was playing Wizard.
And you went up against Porcelain Legionnaire, and it's just like, that's it.
Yeah. You know who won that match? Me.
No, you didn't.
Yeah, I did.
Oh, you meddling mage did.
I didn't beat you, Jake, but
sorry. I thought you were talking about the match where we played, where I had Porcelain Legionnaire. I was like, you didn't win that match.
No, I beat Hazard, though.
That's right. Yeah. Hazard was playing Porcelain Legionnaire.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, but Jake got me with the Porcelain Legionnaires. They were pretty good. And I agree. I mean, they're certainly a threat. You really have to be able to deal with those. Also, Kasali Pride Mage, which makes all of your other guys attack for 3.
And has the added bonus of, like we said, being able to sacrifice and kind of blow up your opposing bridges, which is a big game, as they say.
I know. I've used Kasali Pride Mage on my own artifacts to blow up opposing bridges.
Yep.
You don't feel, though, that there's some... I mean, you say that you don't want to drop a Tarmogoyf on turn 2, but because he doesn't do anything to necessarily affect the board state. Does Porcelain Legionnaire really do anything more than Tarmogoyf when you drop him against turn 2 against a non-dude deck?
Well, so, I think when we say non-dude deck, we have to put a little asterisk and make sure that we're including in non-dude decks shops that aren't aggro.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Because they still run Lodestone Golem, and that's how they're going to win generally.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Karn is a card, but for the most part, I mean, we're concerned about their Lodestone Golems, like, kind of stopping us from doing anything. And Porcelain Legionnaire does a lot against Lodestone Golem. That being said, it's also a 2-of.
Legionnaire is also an artifact, so he plays more easily through Lodestone Golem and also plays through Thorn.
Yep. Like I said, whereas Tarmogoyf gets stuck in your hand because this deck obviously doesn't run that many mana sources, Porcelain Legionnaire can almost always get on the board. I mean, the only effect that hits him is actual Sphere. Additionally, although it has not happened many times, the fact that he's an artifact is relevant with the Goblin Welder.
Oh, sure.
The fact that we can occasionally get back a Pithing Needle or get back a Grafdigger's Cage off of a Porcelain Legionnaire has been relevant.
Right, and you're playing 3 Goblin Welders.
Yeah, I think Goblin Welder is actually more of a must in aggro decks than I think a lot of other than in Aggro-Control decks than I think a lot of other people do. This is a Mark Trogdon innovation, but I think he's absolutely right. And here's the thing, when your opponent has Tinker in their deck, and you play Goblin Welder, they can't win with Tinker.
Right.
Yeah.
And, I mean, that is huge. Additionally, it's just a 1-drop, and there aren't obviously many 1-drops that aren't Pitting Needles and Graph Digger's Cages in the deck, but it's a 1-drop that lets you kind of interact favorably with almost every deck in the format other than Dredge.
Mm-hmm. Especially with, you also have 2 Gorilla Shamans. Between those 2 cards, you can really control the board against a workshop deck.
Absolutely. The only problem is...
That's eat your board right there.
Yeah, and especially when we have a lot more problems with, like, the aggro versions. Like, I mean, when you have aggro mode and they're dropping lots of big dudes, if they have Razormane Masticore, like, being able to say, eat your Mox, weld out your Razormane Masticore is very important.
Sure, yeah.
And Welder just enables a lot of broken plays. I think Goblin Welder is maybe the card that I have, since coming back to Vintage, played more than anything else, regardless of deck. And I don't understand why people don't play Goblin Welder more. I think he has kind of fallen out of favor in a lot of Vintage decks, and he just seems so powerful to me.
He's pretty broken. I mean, like, I played him in Belcher. He's good in all kinds of decks.
Yeah. I'm just surprised the blue decks don't play him as much as they used to. I mean, I understand that Thirst for Knowledge has a lot to do with that, that being restricted, but it still seems like a very good card to me.
Yeah. Let me ask you, so how do you get away without playing Force of Will? I mean, are you worried about the first turn? And what about the top deck, too? I mean, that's the other thing, is like, you get a lot of times, I know, especially against black decks, where you can rip apart your opponent's hand, but if they draw the right card, they still win. Like, they still resolve Tinker or Yawgmoth's Will and can do something.
And that's what a lot of the kind of cards that are around that are these permanent, like, that's one of the reasons that this is a nicer deck, I think, in some ways, because your solutions to those cards stay in play if they're not used. So, like, Quasali Pride Mage answers Time Vault no matter when it comes up. You just have to get that or Torch Fiend in play, and Time Vault isn't a concern until they answer the card. Like, you have a lot of creatures that, in addition to attacking for small amounts of damage, just sit on the board and say, I'm ready to be, they're seals of whatever that thing is.
Right.
And forcing a blue player into that position where they not only have to tap top deck, but also have to find an answer and a top deck.
Right.
Is sort of like where we're trying to be. That being said, Yawgmoth's Will definitely still accounts for wins against the deck. Yawgmoth's Will is one of the most powerful cards.
Well, you've still got main deck Graph Digger's Cages, and things like Phyrexian Revoker, shutting down Moxes and things like that can certainly keep them from having a big turn. Yeah,
I mean, that's true, but I think, like, there's a point at which because we have no way of drawing extra cards.
Right.
I think that's where, like, when they play a value spell, they play Yawgmoth's Will for value, that's when you get really burned. And the problem with relying on Graph Digger's Cage and Phyrexian Revoker, though they're very good, is that Hurkyl's Recall answers them against you just as well as it answers shops.
Right.
So, I mean, that's one of the reasons, in fact, that Stony Silence is so good for these kinds of decks.
Mm-hmm.
Because there aren't as many main deck answers. I mean, you see Nature's Claim every once in a while, but the fact that it doesn't get Hurkyl's Recalled is a very important kind of facet to these decks being able to be played.
Well, Rest in Peace exists now. Do you ever consider playing Rest in Peace against, Dredge and also Yawgmoth's Will?
Well, I have 4 of them in the sideboard of this deck.
Yeah, I see that.
And they
bring them in against Yawgmoth's Will? I guess that's my question.
I mean, you do. The good thing about that matchup is there are cards that you don't want as much. I generally don't keep Graph Digger's Cage in against those decks.
Okay.
Because while it can stop Yawgmoth's Will, like I said, Hurkyl's Recall hits it, and they're going to be Hurkyl's Recalling you, in my experience.
But doesn't it also stop Tinker?
It does. So this has not happened very many times, but I have had people side out Tinker against me.
Interesting.
Well, I mean, so when you play, if you go first turn Welder, second turn Graph Digger's Cage, plus something else.
I guess they're sort of expecting Graph Digger's Cage all the time, so it's like, I'm not even going to bother trying to Tinker.
Yeah. It's not like an always kind of a thing, but I've done it before. I've definitely brought in Rest in Peace, but I don't usually bring in all 4 against those decks, because the main deck has a lot of good cards. I probably side out Porcelain Legionnaire, against most blue decks, unless they're playing a dude blue deck. But Porcelain Legionnaire is not very good, and I probably side out Lightning Bolts against them as well.
But keeping in, Swords?
Well, yeah, so Swords is the added bonus of answering Tinker while still not losing to Hurkyl's Recall.
Gotcha. Right, and you're not worried about the fact that Swords doesn't hit Jace?
Oh, not at all. Jace isn't actually very good against this deck.
You run him over.
I agree. Jace never seems very good against a full-fledged aggro-control deck.
Yeah.
In addition, if ever Pitting Needle and Phyrexian Revoker are going to be good.
Right.
I mean, we do have 6 of that effect against Jace. I've blind named Jace more than almost anything with the deck,
Mm-hmm.
other than occasionally Black Lotus when, that's their way to win with Revoker. But yeah, I mean, it really depends. The other thing is that you have this kind of mentality with a deck like this, where you have to kind of be pre-sideboarded in some way. And for Ohio, that means pre-sideboarded more against shops. So I have some extra cards against shops in here in the main deck that I can, potentially cut. There have been times that you cut some number of Torch Fiends and bring in a different kind of artifact destruction spell. Again, against blue decks, they tend to not expect much of you.
I guess that's true.
And one of the things that you can do is if you side out your guys that kind of sit on the board and are answers that way and bring in things like Ancient Grudge, you can really catch them off guard because they don't see the Ancient Grudge in the main and you're already pretty heavily boarded for shops or for artifacts. So you can kind of create those situations. But those situations are rare. It really depends on the opponent a lot too. You can kind of get a good sense we know a lot of the people that play Vintage in the area. So that helps, but if you don't, I think that it's easier, it's a more convivial atmosphere, so you get a sense of whether or not your opponent thinks your deck is hilarious or a joke, pretty quickly.
Maybe both.
Yeah. Whereas I think people in Legacy or whatever, they're serious business. They're gonna, beat you and keep their game face on until the end and then maybe ask you why you're playing, Torch Fiend in your deck.
Right.
Vintage, they'll ask you, when it comes into play.
Why are you playing that?
Yeah, I think that might be a direct quote of one of my opponents in one of these tournaments.
You hit on
or occasionally just the high five.
Yeah,
you can get the high five for Torch Fiend.
You hit on something earlier that I wanted to ask you about because it's something that I experienced when I was playing. This is going back, and you're gonna laugh, but I was playing The Mountains Win Again back in
that deck was solid.
8 or 9.
Not for you, but it was solid.
Yeah. So that was black, white, red. And I found that there was a high correlation between having turn 1 or 2 Bob and winning the game. So much so that I actually put in, and you're gonna laugh, 1 Phyrexian Arena to have a total of 5 black card drawers to just have a higher consistency in getting that. So do you feel not playing blue means you're losing out on a lot of the good card draw? Do you feel that when all you get is 1 card per turn and that's it?
Absolutely. You definitely get in situations occasionally where you are out of cards and you're like, I need this to be something, and it's a land, or it's a, it's a Mox and you have Stony Silence in play and you're like, why am I playing this deck? But at the same time, because all of your cards do so much work, they're a lot of the time worth more than 1 card. And what that means to different people is, kind of up in the air. I don't think of a lot of the cards in the deck as 2-for-1s because they are always just trading for one thing, like either they're a creature or they're killing an artifact, but they're never doing both.
Right.
Except for Welder, which we already talked about. But that nature, that ability to kind of have multiple roles all the time for almost every card in the deck. The only cards that aren't doing more than one thing are Swords and Bolt.
Right. Well, and even Bolt, you can target a creature or target your opponent. Yeah,
that's true. So there are so many situations where these cards have different roles and are kind of simultaneously fulfilling multiple roles.
Right.
That it doesn't always, while you have fewer cards in your hand, they're kind of creating action. They're doing more than one thing, they're doing multiple kinds of jobs.
Right, and a lot of these have sort of implicit card advantage because you're shutting down an entire path to victory for your opponent.
Yeah.
I have this Grafdigger's Cage, so now you can't tinker or play Yawgmoth's Will. It's...
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons that, traditional card advantage isn't the best way to describe decks in Vintage.
Right.
Because, while there are decks where that's very good and the card quality is very high, because cards do so much. How many cards is, Sphere of Resistance worth in a Shops deck?
Right.
It does so much work. It's affecting all of your opponent's cards. It's potentially making it so that instead of casting 2 or 3 spells a turn, they're casting 1. That to me feels like multiple cards, but you're not drawing extra cards. Right. So I think that kind of analysis of decks starts to fall apart a little bit. That being said, I think my next version of this deck, if it runs green, is gonna run Sylvan Library.
Okay. As an actual card advantage engine.
And even just card selection. I think you do run the fetch lands, and I think there's times when you just really need to top deck something, and being able to kind of set up your draw a little bit is nice.
Sure. Well, let me ask you a little bit about that. There's obviously, if we're talking non-blue, that still accounts for 4 colors that you have to choose from.
I mean, they're almost colors.
Right. I assume that the different colors would give you different advantages against different metagames, right? I mean,
absolutely.
On what the colors do.
One of the problems, though, is that you're constrained because the best cards in these decks are a lot better than some of the other cards. I think that it's almost a non-starter to not play red.
Okay.
I think
because red answers artifacts and blue cards?
Yes.
Okay.
And specifically lets you play Goblin Welder and Simian Spirit Guide, which we haven't talked much about Spirit Guides yet.
Okay.
But the Spirit Guides are really important because, one, they let you play through things in shops that a lot of other decks can't.
Okay.
Because they're a mana source that doesn't require you to pay mana to put it into play.
Right.
And in addition, they play through Stony Silence, which is obviously part of your game plan. So being able to play Spirit Guides is like a big bonus. And while you can do that in green, I think that green is the weakest color for these decks, other than Qasali Pride Mage, who's maybe the best card. So that's one of the tough things. Because Qasali Pride Mage does everything you want it to do. It beats for 3, it blows up artifacts or enchantments. I mean, it's just, it does all the work, and it sits on the board, and it does all that for colorless mana. Which can be a problem in a 3-color deck where you don't get to kind of fix things in a better way and you're playing against shops.
Yeah, Qasali Pride Mage seems really good.
Yeah.
He's very good.
I know that guy has beaten me many a time, and I've been playing different decks each time, so it's...
Yeah, he's either too big to deal with dudes, or he's the guy that shuts down your enchantment or artifact. He just does all of that stuff pretty well.
And in this list, the list that we're kind of talking about right now, he's the only green card. In the main deck, at least. I mean, like, Ancient Grudge is, half a green card in the sideboard, but he's the only green card, but he's worth the color by himself, at least in this version. Right. I think that might change, but there's no card that replicates this. I mean, Torchfiend, I think, is the next closest, and it's so much worse. I mean, I still think Torchfiend is good. He
doesn't blow up enchantments, too?
He doesn't blow up enchantments, and it costs a red mana to activate him, and he's always a 2/2. Like, he's worse in every respect, but I still play 4 of them, because Qasali Pride Mage is so good.
Right. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about red and green. Red answers blue and artifacts, and green has Qasali Pride Mage. And I guess
Tarmogoyf, if that's your thing, but
right. And you even said that you'd be playing Sylvan Library next time.
I don't think you can shortchange Grudge either. That's always a 2-for-1 and pretty nice.
It is, but red also gives you access to Ingot Chewers and gives. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can kind of do if you don't have the green route.
Right.
So I mean, Ancient Grudge is very good. Don't get me wrong, but I think that Ancient Grudge is not nearly as strong an argument, at least for me, as Pride Mage is.
What do you get from black, then?
So, black is primarily Dark Confidant and Thoughtseize.
Okay.
And I have tried a Jund build, which is funny because I think we can talk about that a little bit more, but the version of the deck that is similar to mine that is kind of Jund flavored did it primarily for Dark Confidant. We ran, I think, 2 or 3 Thoughtseizes. And there's a couple other black cards that you can consider. I mean, Dark Blast is very good right now in Vintage.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's, like, not very much of a cost to run 1 of that card.
Right.
But Dark Confidant in a deck like this actually doesn't do enough, was my experience.
I was gonna ask you about that when we were talking about card advantage earlier, because you mentioned the fact that when you drop a creature, you want it to do something, and very often recently when I drop a Dark Confidant in turn 2, I feel like my opponent just goes forward with the game plan and I don't get the mileage out of Confidant that I need to get ahead. I've already lost.
Yeah, Confidant might replace himself, but you don't get far enough ahead.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think you need him to, like, I think the places where he really shines are decks where you have insane bombs. And this deck has a lot, like, more even card quality.
Sure.
There isn't a Tinker, and there isn't Yawgmoth's Will for you to, like, get to more quickly. The other thing that you can get from black is Tutors, which, again, is kind of answering that same edge case where, like, well, we don't have bombs. It can be nice. I mean, I ran Demonic Consultation because why on earth in a deck with mostly, like, 4 and 3-ofs would you not run Demonic Consultation?
Right.
I mean, it's nice to be able to select a card, but the card quality is not high enough. And, against shops, I mean, Sphere Effects exist, and having to pay what amounts to, like, 4 or 5 mana for your 2-drop as opposed to 3 is a big difference. So, I mean, I think that's part of the issue. But I do like black. I think that there's probably some lists that are very different in style from mine that run black, or that could run black. A long time ago, I want to say, I don't know, maybe 2006, I ran a white-black deck in Vintage almost all the time, and it was alright. I think my opponents were running, well, when did Gifts Ungiven come out? Like, somewhere around that time period. But they were running Gifts Ungiven and I was running white-black creatures, and it was okay.
That seems totally unfair.
Yeah.
Well, at that time it was very good to run True Believer.
Uh-huh.
And True Believer has actually gotten a little bit better. If he didn't cost double white, he'd be a lot better. But, I mean, the fact that he shuts down Oath of Druids now is pretty important, actually. Like, that's, if you live in an Oath of Druids metagame and for some reason decide you want to play Aggro-Control all the time, get those True Believers out. Because he's very good. I mean, he has a lot of value. There's other stuff that he does. If you live in a meta with a lot of combo, also true. As it turns out, once again, I live in Ohio.
Yeah.
I like how we established that if you're playing in an Oath metagame and you decide to play Aggro-Control, you might be an idiot.
I mean, that's true.
You know what? Actually, I don't think that's true, though.
Oh, it is.
Well, but you have so many different answers against Oath. Like, you can remove enchantments. You have Kasali Pride Mage to remove enchantments. You have Grafdigger's Cage. You have True Believer that you can play. I mean, there's so many ways to answer Oath.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. The problem is, like, alright, say that that's the metagame that you're in. It's not like they don't have other cards.
Right.
It's not like Oath is the only card in that deck. They're still playing a blue deck in Vintage.
But it's not like you don't have other cards either. I mean, you're still primarily focused against blue, and you have a lot of ways to shut down their primary plan. Is that, I mean...
Yeah. I mean,
maybe I'm wrong.
My experience has not been positive against Oath. That being said, the Oath list that I've played against with this deck is the long Oath Gristlebrand deck. And that deck plays Oath or just wins the game on turn one.
That one seems like a nightmare for you. I mean,
yeah, that's startlingly bad.
Oath.
Yeah. I don't know, I think it depends a lot on what the version of Oath is and what their game plan is. I mean, the other thing is, the last time I was playing Oath, I had many discard spells, and I don't know how in flavor that is in places where there's a lot of non-burning long Oath going, but those cards are very good against you because your cards have to do so much work that when you have, more than one Thoughtseize played against you or more than one of that effect, it can be pretty devastating.
Right.
So, especially since some of our cards don't do anything against Oath. Like, many of the other cards in the deck, like, do something against blue decks. But what does Phyrexian Revoker do? I mean, okay, name Gristlebrand. I'm not beating a 7/7 life blinker anyway.
It activates Oath. What are you talking about?
Yeah, there you go.
It's actually detrimental to your Oath game.
Yeah. I mean, and there are cards like that. I mean, also your Lightning Bolts aren't generally very good. Your Stony Silences don't matter. And Goblin Welder is really bad in that matchup. And if I have Goblin Welder in my opening hand, I almost always play it on turn one, unless, my opponent is holding up double blue or something.
It seems like a really sad day when you go first turn Goblin Welder and they answer with first turn Oath, and you're just like, neat.
Yeah.
Game.
I think it can be pretty well established that, like, in the paper, rock, scissors, if there is such a thing in Vintage, Oath is on the beating whatever crappy thing Aggro-Control is into the ground.
Right.
So people are playing paper, rock, scissors, and Aggro-Control is getting stomped under the heel of Oath, I think, in that game.
That makes sense. I
mean, it's not impossible, but it's certainly the worst matchup.
Right.
With that being said, sometimes you just say, well, there's not that much Oath played around me, and I'm just gonna ignore the fact that it exists a little bit.
I have scarcely seen Oath other than in Burning Long lately.
Yeah, other than Steve winning a TSO with it.
Yeah, well,
So I guess the most important thing then is to sort of have a plan of what your metagame is going to be, right? I mean, like, you want to know within reason what the decks you're going to face are, and then do you choose your colors based on that and choose the creature, or choose the cards then based on what you have available?
I think that for almost any meta, I want to have, well, I guess that's not true. If we were in the Oath meta, I would maybe not want to have red, but for most cases, I want to have for sure red and likely white.
Okay.
Because they're both just very strong. And I think the last color can change a little bit depending on your meta, but it's more about the specific cards, because there are more hate cards that exist at this point in Magic. I mean, it's, the game's 20 years old. There are a lot of hate bears. So your particular mix of those hate bears and, how you choose to kind of, what numbers, I mean, you notice there's a lot of sort of interesting numbers. We have some 3s and 2s and 4s, and that honestly was just from a lot of testing. So, we're lucky in that we know people that play Vintage in our local scene, so I get to play Vintage if I want to. I can play Vintage 2 or 3 times a week. And I'm testing against, Mark Trogdon, who's one of the best Stacks players, or Workshop players in general, and, Twan, who recently won a Mox playing Stacks, or Workshops, I should say. No, it was Stacks. there's just a lot of quality players. When Jerry is playing, he's a very good player, I think, to test against. So by virtue of having, that, you're able to refine. But I think it's more about that. It's more about tweaking your numbers than about actually wholesale changing colors. I think the colors are too different to kind of have the same basic build and try and port it. At least in my experience.
Right.
That being said, I have been playing with the idea recently of cutting green entirely despite Qasali Pride Mage being very good.
And just going
red-white. Which, why not play the two worst colors in Magic?
That's true.
The worst.
Okay. The reasoning for that is just that I think that those colors are really the core for any, especially non-blue, aggro-control deck.
Right.
And I think like we said, we're playing exactly one green card. And it's really good, but it would be nice to be able to play a ton more basics in the deck.
Oh, sure.
Because obviously anytime you can kind of up your basics. I'm already running 5 basics in this deck.
Uh-huh.
But it would be nice to run 6 or 8. I think that, anytime you can do that, your matchup against any workshop deck gets better.
Totally.
And we have recently had printed Shattering Blow in Gatecrash.
Mm-hmm.
That while it doesn't do the same work as Qasali Pride Mage, does very good work.
Yeah, Shattering Blow is a 2-drop, 1 and a white or red split mana.
Mm-hmm.
And it exiles an artifact.
It exiles an artifact, and it's an instant, which is, much better than not being an instant, I suppose.
Right.
Says the guy who's playing however many creatures are in this deck. But, 17 or something. No, I think that card might push you into a place where you feel a little bit more comfortable not running Qasali Pride Mage.
Sure.
Because...
You think that's even better than something like Seal of Cleansing that will hit both artifacts and enchantments?
And once it resolves is uncounterable.
Right.
Yeah,
you got Disenchant, which loses the exile but hits enchantments as well.
Oh, I think the exile is pretty important. So when we talk about cards that are good against this deck, despite the fact that we have a lot of things kind of interacting with them, Tinker Blightsteel is still a concern.
Mm-hmm.
And Qasali Pride Mage and Seal of Cleansing don't do anything to that card, and Shattering Blow does. It answers Blightsteel, which is important. The other thing is that there are the artifacts that you're sacrificing for, like sacrificing to blow up, especially against blue decks, so not as much against workshops because they have more redundancy, but when we play against blue decks that have these very powerful cards, when you destroy, say, Time Vault,
right,
you want Time Vault not to come back from Yawgmoth's Will.
Right.
And it will never come back if you exile it. I've lost to, Hurkyl's Recall and Step, for my Pithing Needle or Revoker that was, naming a Time Vault that I had already destroyed into Yawgmoth's Will, play Time Vault Key, kill you.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I think, being able to say, oh, hey, I have instants in this deck and I end that plan is powerful. It might not work though. It needs to be tested. I haven't done much work with the white red build yet. That's the prep for the TSO. The upcoming TSO.
Right. Yeah, I noticed the Shattering Blow. I think that's an interesting card for Gatecrashes from Gatecrash as well. Do you think that Aggro-Control is a good introductory deck for Vintage? Like, if someone is new to Vintage, do you recommend that for them?
It's funny. I think that there are reasons that you can say that it's a good deck. Right. For the intro player, the main reason is that it's one of the decks that plays the most similarly to, a traditional Magic deck. Which I think is a big problem for a lot of Vintage decks. If you hand someone Shops, or if you hand someone, I don't know, however many tutors there are in blue decks right
if
now.
You give them a blue control deck with a bunch of tutors and...
Or even Dredge. Dredge is, until you learn how to play Dredge, it's hard to play correctly. Right. And I think this deck at least has creatures and spells, and we have some sense of how to do that from other formats.
Right.
That being said, it's still not an easy deck to play. There are a lot of interactions. I think playing Goblin Welder correctly is hard to do.
Yeah. It's a hard deck to play simply because it's so tuned for a metagame. It's not like you have to know whether to blow something up with Qasali Pride Mage or wait to blow up something more relevant. Do you blow up every Mox that comes along with Torch Fiend, or do you wait? Yeah, and the other thing about that is, that might not even be specifically metagame, but just about the format in general. You have to know what cards to care about in general in the format, and it's hard to do that if you're unfamiliar. So, I'm gonna say, if I was suggesting a deck for a new player to Vintage, I think the decks that I would suggest would be blue aggro-control decks, because the ways that you're interacting with your opponent are much more, they make a lot more sense to you. And while you still have to evaluate what the best threats are, I think, people that have played Legacy and have played Rug or have played Standard or even Modern in the new red, white, blue deck that's being played in Modern,
That's
Right.
really similar to some of the blue decks, the blue Aggro-Control decks in Vintage.
Yeah. Okay.
So, I mean, I think you can, and I think you'll learn very quickly by playing a deck like this. I mean, that's how I learned how to play Vintage. I didn't have the cards, and I wanted to play, and that was what people were playing, so... I mean, I had 4 Force of Wills, but Mono Blue Control apparently was not good after, the 2 years that I tried to play it. So,
right.
I scraped together some creatures that looked like they might work and tried to understand it that way. And I think it's helped my ability to play Vintage a lot.
Yeah, it certainly puts you onto a better training path, I think. I mean, like you learn faster what's good and what's not in Vintage. But at the same time, I don't know that I'd actually recommend it for someone because it's so... You start with a big power deficit immediately.
Well, yeah, I mean, it also doesn't feel good to, like, start playing when your opponent gets to cast all the cool spells.
Right.
Like, even though sometimes they don't work, and, like, the fact that your opponent has Ancestral Recall doesn't matter, which is really awesome.
Right.
Like, when that happens, you're like, this deck is sweet, because I'm attacking him with Torch Fiend, and his Ancestral Recall means nothing.
Yeah.
Like, that's awesome. And also tilts your opponent, which is great.
Right.
But,
yeah, I know playing against these are very frustrating.
I think you're right. I think if you're exposing new players to Vintage, you want them to see the fun. You want them to see the ridiculousness of playing a Vintage deck that they don't get in other formats. And there's not a lot that happens in this deck that can't happen in another format.
Right, that demonstrates that. Speaking of opportunities to play Vintage, there's a Team Serious Open coming up on February 9th in Sandusky, Ohio. Just kind of wanted to promote that a little bit. And Jake, are you going to be playing Aggro-Control there?
I think I am. If I can get White Red to work, I'm going to play that. If not, I'll tweak this Naya build a little bit.
Okay.
But yeah, I think it'll be a good, I'm tired of playing, non-Aggro Control.
Excuse my dummery, but will Gatecrash be out by then? So will you have Shattering Blows?
Yeah, Gatecrash is out as of Friday.
Oh,
yeah.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
Which
Jeff,
also,
what are you packing?
Well, after getting thoroughly trounced playing Landstill against some of your decks...
You're not playing Landstill.
No, I'm not playing Landstill. I think I might end up playing Bomberman, actually.
Well, that sounds okay.
Yeah.
that deck's been doing...
I think you'll enjoy that one.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I really am attached to is the counter package. Everything else, I think, can go away, and Bomberman has that really heavy counter package, which is always what I like to enjoy.
Yeah.
It's funny though, my experience with Bomberman, especially lately, has been it's any other blue deck, because you win with Bomberman that combo so rarely.
Yeah.
I mean, they're good cards. It's one of the nice things because it's a combo deck where the cards actually do stuff. But yeah, it's just sad when you can't, when you don't get to use the fun combo to win the game. You just like are playing a blue deck, and sometimes you win with Jace.
Yeah, I know when I was playing Bomberman a while ago, it was like, I'm winning by attacking with 2/2s.
See, you too feel the allure of Aggro-Control.
I know. Yeah, but the other thing is that I have this 2/4 that just stays at home and blocks all of your 2/2s.
It's true. That guy is a beating against this deck. Oh, that's so sad.
Yeah, he'll even knock down your Porcelain Legionnaires, won't he?
Yep.
Yeah, good thing I have lightning bolts and
swords.
and swords to even up that matchup.
Yeah.
What are you going to be playing, Nat?
I'm not really sure. I'm probably going to be playing Workshops, and I will probably play Forge Master Staves. Although the last time I tested it, I did not have very good luck, so I was discouraged.
That must have been after we tested it.
Yes, it was after I tested against you and just cleaned the floor with your face repeatedly. So I think that's what I'm going to be playing. Do we have any interesting predictions about the metagame? Has anyone, I assume it's going to be the typical Cleveland metagame with, like, 50% shops.
I heard a rumor that Twan was not going to be playing his build of Twanspresso stacks.
What?
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
I don't know. I mean, maybe he got tired of winning already.
Yeah, I like how Twan just starts winning with something and then is like, no, I don't want to do this anymore. I've got to start taking last place again. That's where I feel comfortable.
I'm gonna go back to Psychotog.
Oh god. Yeah, I think Randall might be coming, which means that it's possible someone will be playing Belcher.
Oh, that's true.
Although I actually heard a rumor that he might be playing a Gate Crash card in his deck that is not Shattering Blow.
Well, he's going to be playing that new Duskmantle Seeker? Duskmantle Seeker?
No, I think it's a different blue-black card actually. It's not the one that is Bob for both of you.
Right.
It's the one that when it hits your opponent, it like flips the top card and it's exiled, and then you can cast that card.
Oh, okay.
You have to pay, or you can play that card.
I do believe we summarily dismissed that card last episode.
Well, this would be Randall's opportunity to prove us wrong.
It's true.
Wouldn't be the first time.
No, it certainly wouldn't.
And I mean, he's a person that likes to play cards that are that other people have dismissed. I would say.
Yeah,
he's the person
really
that
has embraced
the
rogue ideal.
Yeah. But I mean, he played Tithe, and I think Tithe is a card that is definitely interesting.
Oh yeah. Oh, he always he puts together stuff that's playable. I mean, it's cards that deserve to be brought out every once in a while just to see if they work.
Yeah.
And sometimes they do.
Yeah. And it's important to have people doing that, otherwise we all play the same decks, forever. That's no good.
I agree.
That's true.
Well, I'm actually hoping that we get some new players out this time. We've been doing pretty well at recruiting in Columbus, and I'm hoping that a few new players will make the drive up or ride up with us or ride up with me and whoever else goes with me. And
yeah, you said you had 3 new people at Monday this week?
yeah, we had 3 new people. One guy actually works at the store, and he's usually hanging around and lamenting how he doesn't have a vintage deck, and we're like, you should just proxy a deck, or here, borrow mine. And so he finally did, and I know he ended up playing against another guy who I had lent my Forge Master Staves deck to, and he was losing pretty poorly. So I don't know that it was an encouraging start to Vintage for him, but we did have some other players new to Vintage, and actually we had a tournament, 9-player tournament 2 weeks ago. There are a few people there that I was able to talk to about Vintage and sort of evangelize a little bit and try and get them into the format. So I'm always encouraged that there are people who are interested in the Vintage cards and, getting into the Vintage tournaments that we do have in Ohio. So
it is interesting to me though how people think that it's so unapproachable. Even people that play Legacy, and Legacy decks are hard to play, and Legacy decks have expensive cards in them, and there is a lot of, initial reluctance right up until the time when they first, cast Time Walk.
Right.
Tinker for Blightsteel, cast Yawgmoth. When those things happen, you just get so excited.
See, that's always my thing, is Vintage is an exciting format. There are big things that happen in Vintage, and there's things that happen in Vintage that you can't do elsewhere. And that's really what I want to try and show to people is, that Vintage is fun and doesn't always end on turn 1 or 2. And in fact, it infrequently ends on turn 1 or 2. Usually it's a longer game and you have some back and forth, and
you can just sit down and do it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest thing. As soon as you've played Vintage more than once or twice, you want to play it all the time.
Yeah.
It's just getting that initial little jump, that little bump into it, and then you're just, it's what you want to do.
Yeah, I think so too. And one other opportunity to play Vintage would be at Gen Con, which is coming up in this summer. And,
coming up in, 6 months?
8 months?
Hey, you know what? It's still coming up, and they just had early registration, so this is why I bring it up. If you want to go to Gen Con, you can register now. But what you can't do is get a hotel room.
Yeah, this entire week has been hotel drama as we find out that everywhere is sold out already.
Well, and we had people calling them the first 5 minutes that there were rooms. It was ridiculous.
Yeah, I think the Gen Con housing bureau is pretty cruel at times, but
hey, it's all right. I hear there's a good place to pitch a tent that only charges you a really nominal fee.
I guess when you put it that way.
Oh my.
Okay, so we're all going to be pitching tents at Gen Con all over the place.
Oh goodness, that was not how I intended that to be interpreted at all.
And you know what? It's immortalized forever on the internet. So congratulations.
Sure Oh good. Speaking of Gen Con,
yeah, I think that for us, it's weighing 3 things. You have to, of course, weigh cost, then you have how close you are to the convention center, and then you have how close you are to the liquor store.
Right.
It's
true.
The
liquor store is pretty important. I know last year we had a lot of, there were a lot of people drinking Jaeger bombs last year, which I felt was a mistake all along. Even though it could have been a lot worse. Because, as you drink Jaeger bombs, you also could expel Jaeger bombs, and that didn't happen. So I guess there's that. But
yeah, the entire time, of course, I don't drink, so I was not partaking in the Jaeger bombing, but I couldn't really pick up on whether everyone was drinking Jaeger bombs ironically or whether they actually wanted to drink Jaeger bombs. And I'm still not sure.
I was drinking them reluctantly.
I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the rest of the guys who were drinking tons of them and forcing them on people, including you.
Yeah. I'm still going to choose to believe that it was ironically, because otherwise I really have to find new friends.
Well, so what should they have been drinking, Nat?
I'm really not an expert in cocktails. I prefer beer and bourbon, and I prefer bourbon neat and without ice, which I guess is also neat. But anyway, I don't put a lot of effort into actually making a drink. The only drink that I ever put real effort into making is a Tom Collins, and that's only if I have all of the proper ingredients, which are gin, confectioner's sugar, club soda, lemon juice, and an orange and maraschino cherry as a garnish.
So you would never deign to use a Tom Collins mix?
Oh, are you kidding me? Tom Collins mix is horrendous.
Most pre-made mixes for things in general are pretty horrendous. But
well, yeah, my problem with them is that they are way, way too sweet.
Sure.
That syrupiness just doesn't work for me. It gives me heartburn, and I don't enjoy it.
I've got to ask since this came up, because anytime I see somebody drinking like margaritas at a party, it's always margarita mix.
Yeah?
Is margarita mix terrible, or is that like the exception to the rule, or...
Margarita mix is usually okay because it's frozen.
Okay.
Well, even a regular margarita, a non-frozen margarita, mixes are usually okay. They're not too bad. Spoken as someone who doesn't really like tequila at all, I will occasionally drink a pre-mixed margarita if that's the thing that's happening.
Yeah.
I don't have nearly the revulsion toward that as I do toward things that have, say, Rose's Grenadine in them, or sour mix, or Collins mix if it comes up.
Okay, so Jake, we've established that you'll join the bandwagon if they're drinking margaritas.
Jake succumbs to peer pressure.
Jake, will you drink Jaeger bombs if they are forced upon you by other members of Team Sirius?
I'm not a very high-ranking member of Team Sirius.
That just means you're more likely to get in your face.
What I would say is, I probably would, but I only say that because I've been in a situation where Jaeger has been forced on me before, and in that situation I caved. Despite the fact that I pretty much hate Jaeger, and really hate Red Bull.
Oh, yes, Red Bull is definitely the worst part of the Jaeger bomb.
We totally have to also explain that the Jaeger bombs that were consumed last year at Gen Con were not actually genuine Jaeger bombs. Instead of Red Bull, they were made with Diet Rockstar.
Yeah, and there were tons of cans of that in our restroom. The whole bathroom just smelled of Diet Rockstar. Which
if it smells anything like Red Bull, was not a good smell.
No, it's nauseating.
Yeah.
It's like metallic Jolly Ranchers.
Yeah. Oh, it's gross. I'm thinking of it now, and it's gross.
Pretty good explanation. I like it.
And Jake, what is your what's your preferred cocktail of choice?
Well, to be honest with you, if I'm drinking liquor, I would prefer to be drinking Scotch neat. So we have that kind of in common. But after going to Scotland, I got a little bit snobby about the Scotch thing. So I don't like bourbon that much. It's too sweet for me if I'm drinking just liquor. I do like bourbon, which is funny. I'm going to add sugar in this cocktail that I'm going to talk about, but I really like a well-made old-fashioned, which if you haven't made an old-fashioned before, is an orange and a maraschino cherry or some kind of cherry with sugar and bitters, and you kind of muddle those together and then add ice, well pack a rocks glass with ice and then add whiskey.
Okay.
I'm a big fan of old fashions. I think they're really good, and I think it's one of those drinks that you very much get the taste of the liquor, but there's other things playing off it. I think bitters is a really interesting taste profile, and there's a bunch of different kinds, so.
Yeah, do you have a recommended bitters, or?
I use, so the kind of type is Angostura bitters. Angostura bitters, as opposed to an orange or another, kind of bitters, is the most important thing. There's a bunch of different kinds out there, and they're all slightly different, but they're all pretty tasty. And the good thing about this drink is that you get to try those. So that's my go-to. That being said, I also am pretty partial to Dark and Stormies because they have them everywhere now, and ginger beer is awesome.
That's true. I do like ginger beer.
So ginger beer and dark rum and a lime is a pretty easy drink, and it's hard to screw up, and it's very good. And Geoff, what do you like to drink when other people are drinking alcohol if you're not a big fan of the alcohol thing?
Depends on whether I'm at a bar or whether we're recording a podcast.
Well, let's say we're at a bar.
I have a soft drink.
Good story.
Sorry.
Okay, well, let's say we're recording a podcast.
I drink.
Yeah, what are we all
water.
drinking now?
I'm drinking water right now.
Here. You're so much fun.
I'm sorry.
No, it's
Hey,
fine.
people appreciate the designated driver.
You know what? That's
Sometimes.
probably true.
Nat and I are going to raise our glasses to you right now. But yeah, Nat, what are you drinking as we podcast?
Well, I already finished it a while ago because the podcast has been on for a while. But I had it was a chicory stout from Dogfish Head Brewery that was brought to me by Abe Corson when he stayed at our house for Star City Columbus. So I had that, and I dropped a shot of bourbon into it, Four Roses bourbon. So it would be a depth charge of sorts. Boilermaker. Because the alcohol in beer just isn't enough.
And Jake?
Well, I was having, again, I finished because I was drinking it at the beginning of the podcast, but I had a drink of my own creation because I'm actually out of dark rum, but I have ginger beer. I actually made ginger syrup about a week ago, so I've been making my own, ginger beer drinks, and I did that with Bullet Single Barrel Rye, which I had from making old fashions. And I really wanted to try some of the ginger beer, and I figured I wanted a dark liquor, so let's try the rye. It was actually pretty good. I was surprised. It came out a lot better than I expected.
Yeah, close enough.
Yeah.
Sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
I'm sure actually I bet the ginger beer covers up a lot of any harshness in the.
That's true, but I like
alcohol with its own harshness.
Yeah, I like the Bullet Single Barrel Rye a lot.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm making a mixed drink with whiskey or with a kind of whiskey, that's the way I like to go, is with a rye.
Okay.
They don't kind of overwhelm me with sweetness like bourbon does, and it's a good flavor. It still has a lot of that interesting kind of smoky flavor.
Sounds fantastic. Well, it's happened again. You've wasted another perfectly good hour listening to Serious Vintage. I'm Geoff Moes.
I'm Nat Moes.
And I'm Jake Hilty.
And we hope you'll join us next time for more Serious Vintage.
Take a little trip, take a little trip, take a little trip and see. Take a little trip, take a little trip, take a little trip with me.
So we're all going to be pitching tents at Gen Con all over the place.